So let's talk through the mightiest and weakest datasheets of the Astartes with a tier list of Space Marine units in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more. In this video I thought it would be time to do an update of the tier list I made shortly after the Space Marine Codex released, as quite a bit has changed since that, with a fair bunch of points costs going up and down, and people have had far longer to establish what's good. In this video, I thought I'd aim to do a general purpose datasheet tier list for the Space Marines, talking through some of the strongest and weakest options in the Codex and why I'd rank them where I would. Obviously, tier lists in Warhammer 40k are always a bit arbitrary. Some things could easily be ranked a little bit higher or lower, some things will be in the gaps between tiers, and things would definitely vary a whole load depending on the context of your army and your personal playstyle, and perhaps more than anything, detachments within 10th edition. There's certainly going to be some units that are far stronger in one detachment compared with another, meaning that realistically each one will basically have its own tweaked tier list, with some units being far more standout than others. So for the sake of being kind of general purpose here, I'm going to broadly focus on just raw datasheet strength, then try and talk through a few of the more notable detachment things for some of the units that come up, particularly focusing on the armies that tend to get played a bit more competitively. I'd say out of any of them, maybe Ironstorm is perhaps one of the most warping here. It's a very, very strong Space Marine detachment that basically makes the vast majority of ranged vehicle units far more dangerous, and that detachment will probably have just about every vehicle move up a tier. Chapter choice can definitely vary things as well, depending on character access or the other detachments that you can use out of the divergent chapters. Say, for example, we can have some very dangerous assault intercessors if they're paired with sanguinary priests of the Blood Angels. Between all that, it will be a bit rough and ready, but this is aiming to be a rough tier list of 5 tiers of raw Space Marine unit power, and talking a little bit as to the roles they typically fill in more competitive armies. Starting out, we'll go through the weakest units and move our way through to the strongest. In tier 5, I've chosen to rank the 2 units that perhaps feel notably lower than most of the rest, being very, very unlikely ever to feature in competitive lists. Here we've got the Hammerfall Bunker at 175 points, and the Big Bad Thunderhawk Gunship. The Hammerfall Bunker is 175 points and is a static Space Marine fortification. Games Workshop just generally don't seem to want fortifications to be good in 10th edition, and previously in the Index this one had some okay rules, but then they heavily nerfed its Overwatch when the Codex came about. Its damage output just really isn't very good, hitting on 4 pluses, and not able to move and reposition to get lines of sight. It's only really good for being kind of durable at 14 wounds at toughness 12 and a 2+ save, though it can't take objectives and the opponent might just ignore it. Otherwise, the other unit that I've ranked here is the Thunderhawk Gunship, 840 points for a super heavy flyer. For that kind of cost, as you'd expect, you get a fairly dangerous stat line and defensive profile. In theory, it could make some good use of stratagems or any other synergy type things, and deliver a bunch of Space Marines into battle as it does so. For 840 points worth of model, it needs to have a pretty spectacular impact on the battle though, and you're just not really going to get more out of this than a whole bunch of Space Marine tanks with big guns. It's also slightly impractical to move around the board, and OC0, which doesn't help either, and you rarely see people taking this for strength, more for theme and lore. Before we move on, just as a quick aside, I'd just like to quickly mention one way in which you can support the channel if you'd like to, particularly if you're thinking about ordering in any Space Marine units online. Linked in the video description below each video are a few discount links. There's one for Element Games in the UK, Gap Games in Australia, Fenris Workshop in Canada, and Wargame Portal in the USA, generally giving between 10 and 20% off, and can just be one good way to save a bit of money, as well as support Auspex Tactics a little bit if you do happen to be picking anything up. A massive thank you to any of you guys who have been choosing to use those if and when you do buy things. I really appreciate the support. Moving onwards, next we have the units that rank in Tier 4. I mostly consider these kind of overshadowed datasheets that in general won't see too much play versus the things higher up the list, though they mostly at least have something to draw you to them, at least for niche use. First up are the long-suffering Reavers at 85 points per 5. They're the spooky Space Marines that have Battle Shock and get a bunch of precision attacks, but unfortunately the way that Battle Shock works means their rules just aren't really all that impactful currently. Their damage output is just really quite bad with loads of AP 0, and inbuilt deep strike isn't really enough to save them when they're competing with things like the jump intercessors, which are just 80 points, and they're both much faster and a lot more dangerous. Reavers could use the Phobos Lieutenant to get some easy charges out of deep strike, I guess, or the first company enhancement to actually cause some casualties with Battle Shock, but that's not like it's a particularly popular detachment anyway. They basically just need something, either to be cheaper, more threat, or have the Battle Shock rules be more meaningful. While we're on them, we'll talk about the Reaver Lieutenant as well. 55 points just to basically make them a little bit better at battle shock type things. The lethal hits isn't really much of a selling point, as the much better Phobos Lieutenant gets that as well. And even for a niche unit, I'd consider him the second best choice to lead them. I guess he could maybe lead Hounds of Morkai for the Space Wolves, but even then I think he's a tough sell versus just leaving them without a character in the squad. Next up, we've got the Desolation Marines with the missile launcher on a missile launcher. 200 points for a bunch of big hitting anti-tank missile type shots, plus some indirect Castellan shots. These were ridiculously undercosted at the start of the edition, got put up in points by a pretty massive amount, and then basically forgotten about, very inefficient in terms of both indirect fire, and while maybe if you can use both of their firing modes for multiple turns in a row they could justify themselves, I feel like they're rarely going to be able to do that, given that they're just so fragile for the cost. Literally everything will kill them really easily if they step forward to use those actual direct line of sight missiles. If you want indirect fire for Space Marines, Whirlwinds do it a lot better, and these guys just cost too much for what they do. The Invader ATV is 70 points, and I've got a bit more time for this one. It's basically a fast moving expendable gun turret of a unit, not too bad for being a bit of a space filler on the board, and is at least fairly tanky for a biker style unit with a bunch of wounds at toughness 5. I just think at 70 points it's not really where it needs to be, could do with a 5 or 10 point decrease really, as it's kind of underwhelming for its damage and defense and not really cheap and expendable enough for its sort of sacrificial unit type role that you might use it for. It can chip in with a little bit of damage and it definitely isn't unusable. I'd probably rate it around somewhere low tier 3 or high tier 4. I think if you want fast moving biker interference units though, I'd be more tempted by actual Outriders, which are only 10 points more for 3 now. Next up, we've got the Stormspeeder Hailstrike, 130 points for the anti-infantry Primaris Landspeeder. This one's alright against hordes with a bunch of spammed AP0 damage 1 attacks that won't really scare anything much tougher. The main selling point is that it gets an AP debuff rule, meaning that all the rest of your shooting attacks this phase will be AP1 better against your one target that you've shot. It's really quite good, but only affects infantry and mounted type units, so not monsters and vehicles and things. So it can be kind of great in some matchups where maybe you're facing Terminators in cover, but could be pretty tame in others against armies with low saves, high invulnerables, or lots of monsters and vehicles. It's just maybe a bit too limited scope and not particularly take all comers. Next we've got the Astraeus for 525 points. This one's the Resin Forge World Primaris Super Heavy with massive great big grav plates. For the cost it isn't terrible, it's got fairly general purpose damage between the big primary repeater cannon plus some nasty sponsons. Any stratagems or unit synergy will have some big value here, like Tech Marines giving it +1 to hit, or any Ironstorm stratagems that can target it. It does have the downside that its enormous profile will be really hard to move around certain terrain pieces, particularly anything with preset terrain. And in general, while it's not unusable, I feel like you're almost certainly going to get a lot more value out of multiple smaller Space Marine tanks. Maybe a bunch of Gladiators or Dreadnoughts for the same price would usually do more. Next, we've got the lighter Space Marine Stormflyers, the Stormhawk Interceptor at 155 points and the Storm Talon at 165. They move fast and can easily get lines of sight, but just are very fragile to enemy firepower, and their damage output just isn't good enough to really counteract that, I think. The Stormhawk also has the further disadvantage of needing to start off the board and getting a locked flight path when it arrives, which is a further hindrance, even if it probably has the slightly better damage output of the two. In general, I feel like there's just not enough here to justify the negatives that they have versus other Space Marine armor that can hit hard on the ground. The Firestrike Servo turret has got okay firepower for its cost. Generally, I think that the Las Talon far overshadows the autocannons, giving it some ballistic skill 2 plus firepower with strength 10 and twin linked. It's not awful anti-tank or anti-elite firepower, though not really enormously flexible, and its special rule allows it some boosted Overwatch hitting on a 4 plus, which is alright. But there are other things in the Space Marine army that can Overwatch very well, like Land Raider Redeemers, and you still have to spend the 1 command point cost to be able to access that rule in the first place when it might have been better spent on other things. In general, its damage output isn't awful, but it just doesn't really have much to sell it versus other options. Having just a 3-inch move means it's borderline immobile, and given that it doesn't really do anything more than the tanks can do in terms of damage output, means that you're just likely better going for them. Similar sort of damage and defense, but can actually move to get lines of sight really quite a lot easier. It's also got Centurions to compete with if you want slow moving firepower, and they've got a few more synergies that they can do. And they're a bit easier to spend big command point things on them, given that they come in a fairly scary unit even at minimum size. The standard Firstborn Dreadnought is 135 points. This one gives you a reroll aura of 1s to hit for nearby infantry, something that in theory sounds okay on paper and could affect a fair few units, but unfortunately it usually works out to be a bit less impressive as you might expect. Space Marine infantry firebases don't tend to be the most standout thing in the world, and Oath of Moment might often make it kind of redundant, as you might have wanted to put Oath of Moment on a target that you were focusing with lots of guns anyway. Besides that, it's just got some okay melee with a bunch of strength 12 damage 3 attacks, a single heavy weapon that could be a twin-linked las cannon or a multi-melter, and it moves pretty slowly, which will hinder its damage output getting into close combat. Overall, just seems quite a long way behind many of the other Space Marine vehicle datasheets for a similar kind of cost. The Razorback is 95 points and is a Rhino with a heavy weapon on top. It costs 20 points more than the Rhino, which I guess isn't awful for something like a twin-link las cannon shot, in addition to what it would normally do with transport things, but it also gives up things including more transport capacity and a firing deck, which usually means the Rhino gets chosen far more out of the two. Its rule is to allow some reroll wound rolls for units disembarking, which seems good enough on paper for maybe, say, multi-melter devastators. I feel like if these were maybe just a tiny bit more efficient, then Razorbacks might be a bit more tempting. Perhaps Firestorm could be an alright place for it, but just in general it doesn't have a lot of units that really want to get transported inside of it, and the whole setup with this and say Devastators or half a tactical squad just seems very niche and could easily be done by other units. Perhaps things like Hellblasters in an Impulsor on the Primaris side of things. The regular Ancient I feel like doesn't really do enough for his 50 points for the most part. The +1 objective control is his main advantage, which definitely can be useful. Certainly adds a little bit more pressure on objectives and wards against battle shock, but often in 40k it just might not be all that relevant if the unit just gets wiped. And beyond that I just don't think there's much to sell it versus other characters who could do far more in terms of actual damage and defense for the unit, and potentially with other peripheral benefits. I feel like many of the Ancients are only really good if you've got some sort of enhancement that needs to be borne by an Ancient to take it into battle. The Apothecary for 50 points has their main rule being reviving a model each turn, so sort of dependent on the unit he's buffing being able to be damaged but not outright destroyed by the enemy, and with dangerous things in 10th edition, particularly for standard Space Marines in power armor, that often tends not to be the case. I feel like he might have a bit more chance of being relevant if, say, he was able to join Blade Guard veterans and restore those 30.3 wound models, but at the moment he's not. I feel like he's not unusable. Could be nice with Hellblasters in particular, given that they've got a bit more chance of having some chip damage due to their own hazardous rolls. But it's maybe seen as a bit hopeful to be investing the points in the hope that you'll revive models, particularly as he doesn't really do all that much beyond that. He might just be better with something like a Lieutenant to add some extra damage. Finally, I've chosen to rank one special character here in Cato Sicarius. He gives his unit a trio of movement type things, scouts for one unit to get them into the midfield, assault weapons for that unit to allow them to move around quite quickly, though they wouldn't be able to charge after advancing, and a once per game reactive move, which can be kind of disruptive if the enemy moves up to them and then they hide behind terrain or something. None of those are really bad things, and just throwing him into, say, an intercessor unit or assault intercessors could actually be a bit more disruptive than your opponent might imagine. Could be nice enough with company heroes as well, I suppose. He's generally the least commonly taken out of all the Ultramarines characters, though, by quite a way. The advantages just feel a bit peripheral and opponent dependent, really, as opposed to things that just add more damage and defense, or movement tricks and shenanigans that do things that are a bit more out of the ordinary or can be activated every turn. Moving onwards and upwards to Tier 3, here are a bunch of units that I feel like maybe could fill some niche roles in competitive lists, though I'd largely rate them as more usable rather than standout, and I certainly wouldn't expect optimized lists to be made up of a majority of this sort of level of unit. First up, at 140 points, I've tentatively put the Tactical Squad here. Games Workshop actually gave them a meaningful price decrease, so they're now the cheapest Space Marine equivalent. 14 points per model, and they do come with some fancy gear such as a power fist on the sergeant, a las cannon in the squad if you want it, plus a special weapon, and do get you a fair amount of wounds on the table for the points at OC2. Even despite this though, I certainly don't think that they're particularly standout. They don't get any sort of fun special rule to further sell them besides splitting them in half, which most other squads can already be fielded in anyway. And beyond the special weapon carriers, your average Space Marines still compare pretty badly to intercessors, with no AP or weapon keywords and worse melee. I guess maybe you could have them split so you have some basic bolter guys hold down a home field objective for fairly cheap, and then have the dangerous weapons move up the board, maybe in a Rhino or Razorback, or perhaps just foot slogging towards central objectives. Doesn't seem like the worst overall. though both sets of those would have to compete against the other things that could do those roles, say for example infiltrators with their deep strike denial or actual elite damage dealers. Next up, we've got the Stern Guard veterans at 90 points or 180. They basically paid 10 points more than intercessors for some upgraded damage rules. Extra attacks do mean they hit fairly hard in close combat, particularly with a power fist on the sergeant. They get boosted rifles with 3 shots at half range and devastating wounds, but lose out on the objective control 2 and the sticky objectives type rule. I feel like they're in a place where they're usable enough casually, but maybe not particularly stand out. I certainly haven't seen many people running them in competitive lists. Often if people are shelling out for elites, they often tend to go for things that can handle enemy heavy units a bit better, where even with the devastating wounds these guys are going to come up wanting a bit. Next up, we've got the Devastators at 120 points per 5 of them, or 200 for 10. They're focused firstborn with quad heavy weapons. Maybe things like 4 las cannons, multi-melters, or grav cannons would be a reasonable enough way to go. They get to ignore cover if they're static, and they get the heavy weapon benefit, which is kind of nice for anvil keyword, and get a once per game flipped a dice to a 6 with a cherub, which is quite good for one powerful round of shooting. I think their damage output is okay for the cost. They're just a bit fragile for their cost versus tanks, and even when they've taken some chip damage, you do lose a significant amount of their fire. Perhaps best jumping out of things like Razorbacks or other transports. That can work quite well to get some multi-melters in close and get some wound rerolls and things on them, and they could be nice enough in Firestorm that way. In general though, people tend to prefer other marine damage dealers or tanks and vehicles and things, and the Devastators tend to be a bit niche. Next up, we've got the Storm Raven gunship for 260 points. A fast-moving hover flyer with a transport capacity, can transport a dreadnought, and get some fairly good damage. Hurricane bolters, missiles, multi-melters and las cannons and things if you want it. And it's a little bit less fragile than most flyers with -1 damage built in and quite a few wounds. Storm Ravens have seen some competitive play in Ironstorm Spearhead, often paired with a Dark Angel's Landspeeder Darkshroud for a bit of cover for them, delivering a dreadnought into the midfield and then using some powerful damage dealing stratagems on them. They can be quite nice in Firestorm as well for boosted strength multi-melters and hurricane bolters that strike at strength 5. I feel like I would have ranked this in the tier above before the nerf, but losing an extra 20 points really takes the shine off it a bit. I didn't really think it was overpowered before or anything like that, just merely quite a strong option in one specific detachment and a bit more tame in other places. Next up is the Invicta Tactical Warsuit at 140 points. This is the Space Marine Walker that pays a premium for Scout. Its damage output is okay enough against infantry at range, and backs it up with some punchy strength 14 melee, which can allow some big tank shock if you can spare the CP for it. Compared with the Dreadnoughts, certainly the main selling point is that it's got the Scout move to allow it to hopefully get into the midfield and outmaneuver its foes turn 1. It also gets 2 return fire if you target Phobos units nearby, and sometimes that can be kind of meaningful, particularly if you've got quite a few of them around in the army. Otherwise its damage and defense just aren't really all that great for the cost versus the competition, and they tend to be kind of niche. I might have been a bit borderline between tier 3 and tier 4 here. Next up, we've got Space Marine exosuits with siege drills in the Assault Centurions. They're 150 points per 3 of them, and they do have some pretty great damage up close between things like Hurricane Bolters, Flamers or Melter Guns, and the big siege drills that can tear big chunks out of monsters and vehicles. The main issue is getting them there, as they're very slow, and their durability is okay but not stand out given that they're 50 points per model. They can make good use of Armour of Contempt. It likely means that they need help with either a land raider to get them into combat where they do take up a lot of slots. I've seen occasionally people using them in a regular land raider, or perhaps some sort of teleportation trick to maybe allow rapid ingress like Uriel Ventris, though doing that entire thing maybe feels a bit questionable versus just using something with inbuilt deep strike like Terminators. Not having leader options is also a bit of a negative for them, as it means that they can't make use of some fun enhancements. Definitely can be scary enough though if you can get them in close. Next up, we've got the Jump Pack Elite of the Vanguard veterans, 105 points per 5 or 210 for 10 of them. They hit home with fairly anti-infantry attacks with Strength 5, AP 1 and Damage 1, though they do get lethal hits on the charge to make them a little bit more general purpose. High saves can certainly be an issue for them though. Beyond that, they either get a 4+ invulnerable save from Storm Shields or a fancy pistol like a Plasma Pistol to contribute to damage a bit. I've seen more people use the Storm Shields. I feel like in most armies they're kind of tame, but they do get quite good in Blood Angels Sons of Sanguinius, where they're hitting with more attacks and higher strength, plus could have a Sanguinary Priest in the unit for Feel No Pain and extra AP. Cave Strike can be good with them as well. They might not have godly damage output, though it can be really interesting and disruptive if you can't shoot them at long range. Perhaps their biggest issue is the comparison with jump pack intercessors, which are only 80 points now. And given how much cheaper they are, plus getting a power fist in the unit and mortal wound impact hits, I feel like broadly they're the more efficient unit. At 85 points we have the suppressors with 3 models in the unit. These guys are a fairly cheapish unit of ranged deep strikers, with their accelerator autocannons getting a bunch of strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2 shooting, good against some things but very weak against others. They do have to choose between actually being accurate or using their good movement distance though, which is a bit of a trade-off really. So they're either not particularly dangerous or have to stay still, which isn't the greatest, and they are very fragile for the cost, with almost 30 points per marine body. They can be a bit better in Anvil for a +1 to wound if they're static and the opponent can't take them out, and they hand out a -1 to hit for one given target, which can be kind of big if it's something big and imposing. Not useless, but if the opponent can reach them with a bit of firepower, they can fold very quickly. Next up for 180 points is the Whirlwind. Indirect fire is just generally pretty great in Warhammer 40k, but they did bump this up with a big points increase. It hits with a bunch of strength 8 and damage 2 attacks, which is fairly nice in general purpose. You should be able to strip some wounds off most enemy infantry holding down objectives, or potentially just put a bit of focus damage on something that's going to give you the highest return and ideally wants to stay safe out of line of sight. 180 points seems to be a bit too much for most people though. I feel like having one might not be the worst choice in the world, though you probably don't want to go too heavy. I feel like 180 points is certainly paying a big premium for the damage. Next up at 130 points there's the Predator Annihilator. This one brings the las cannons with some focused long-ranged anti-tank shots, 2 sponsored las cannons and a twin-linked main one with a higher strength. It gets to re-roll damage rolls of 1 against monsters and vehicles, so it's pretty nice at taking out hard targets. I feel like it's genuinely not awful for its job, but there are a lot of other vehicles that it's in strong competition for. The Predator Destructor I think is a bit more general purpose and not really all that far behind it in terms of anti-tank damage. The Vindicator is a bit better armoured, and while it's shorter range, has a bit more of a devastating attack. And the Gladiator Lancer has slightly better damage with inbuilt rerolls and that massive damage profile on the Laser Destroyer. I'd say the Predator Annihilator is realistically a little bit behind those, though it does have its advantages. It is nice and cheap at least, and I wouldn't say it's unusable. Next up, for 75 points, there's the Rhino. I feel like this one's a bit of a tricky one to rate really, given that it's absolutely fine for what it does. Rhinos in 40k are just generally seen as pretty efficient transports at 75 points. They're pretty fast, have a good transport capacity, a firing deck and a bit of self-repairing, and they're really quite cheap so you're not spending too many points on it or paying for fancy extras when you just want it to get your unit from A to B. The main issue for Space Marines are the amount of units that can go inside it, so basically not the Primaris, given that I'd say that Devastators and Tactical Marines are kind of mid at best really. It means that outside of Divergent chapters you don't really see too many Rhinos on the table for the Space Marines. They can be nice enough for certain armies though, maybe Black Templar regular Crusader squads, Space Wolf Blood Claws with Ulrich the Slayer perhaps, or Blood Angels Death Company on foot. Definitely can be worthwhile if you've got something good to go in it, but less so if not. Next up we've got the Drop Pod at 70 points. This one's a first turn deep strike unit, paying 70 points to get the Alpha Strike on the enemy. It's generally going to be best for delivering ranged damage dealers. Things like Hellblasters or Infernus Marines maybe feel like an okay choice, perhaps Stern Guard veterans, though it seems that most optimized lists make the decision that they're probably not worth it versus units starting on the board and using other transports or just their base movement and advance and shoot and things to deliver them into damage range. Definitely not unusable though, and knowing that you could throw a big unit of scary Hellblasters to tear big chunks out of the enemy could be really nasty. Might certainly make the opponent rethink how they're deploying stuff, and after their drop pods down it can still contest objectives and just be a bit of an annoying nuisance thing. I've seen occasional lists just use them completely empty for screening and throwing on objectives, as weird as that is. Next up we've got the Land Raider Crusader, which might be being a little bit harsh to putting it down in tier 3, but it just feels like out of the Land Raider variants it's going to be the least most used. It is the cheapest one at 230 points, and instead of scary las cannons or flamestorm cannons it gets hurricane bolters on the sponsons. Will absolutely rip into enemy hordes and could be alright if you know that you're facing loads of 1 wound infantry perhaps, maybe Green Tide or Unending Swarm or similar, but certainly a bit less good than the others against things like harder targets or heavy infantry. Otherwise, it does have a bigger transport capacity than the others, so if you needed, say, aggressors with 2 characters attached, then the Crusader could be the choice out of necessity there. But I feel like unless you're either point squeezed, really want extra anti-horde, or that maximal transport capacity, it's probably going to be the last choice out of the 3, just as the other spawns and weapons give you a bit more bang for your buck, in my opinion. Next up, there's the Stormspeeder Hammer Strike at 150 points. This one's the variant with some fairly heavy close range strength 9 firepower with damage d6 and melter. It is quite fast to get that into range, though quite fragile when it is exposed. 150 points could be lost really quite easily with any sort of half-serious anti-tank weapon. This one's debuff is to remove the benefit of cover for an enemy unit, which certainly isn't bad, though it's maybe not super outstanding for 150 points. I feel like between its threat and that stripping cover rule, then it gets to the point of being usable. I wouldn't say it's one of the standout ones though, and I've certainly seen people use the Thunderstrike more. Finally for tier 3 we've got a whole bunch of characters. The Phobos Captain allows his fun redeploys and free stratagems for some Phobos armoured units, and I think if you are committing to going for a big themed army with lots and lots of Phobos stuff, it can be nice enough to get some perfect knowledge redeploys, moving infiltrators around after you know who's got first turn. Just after that he's probably not going to contribute as much to the game as most of the other characters. The Judas here can give you fights first, most likely to a unit of Blade Guard. It does give you some quite nice counter melee and can make them a hard squad to charge. It does come at the compromise of not making them as general purpose in combat though, given that you can't get lethal hits from a lieutenant if you take this guy, and I kind of need that sort of help against tough stuff. It's definitely solid and can cause problems though. The Phobos Lieutenant can move, shoot, move, so you can do some interesting skirmishing things with units like infiltrators, or maybe do some fairly surprising charges out of deep strike with things like Reavers. And while he is pretty cool, does feel like you might be over-investing a bit in a cheapish skirmish unit, where one of the main advantages is that if they get wiped out, then you don't lose too much. If you put a character in the squad, then that's far less so the case. I've also put the standard librarian here, 65 points for a 4+ invulnerable save for the unit plus some smite damage. It is a bit weird in that he sort of both adds and subtracts per point durability. The 4+ invulnerable save helps, but then you're making the squad a lot more expensive too. Overall, he just feels like he maybe gives you more of a squad without really adding too much. I perhaps would have ranked him borderline T3 or T4. The Blade Guard Ancient for 45 points is one of the cheapest Space Marine characters. He gives you extra OC there and a one-time damage boost for Blade Guard in combat. It's genuinely not too bad for that kind of cost, and he can take him in addition to other characters, which is nice. It's just a shame he doesn't actually come with a proper melee weapon of his own though. The Terminator Ancient, 75 points. He gives you extra OC for a Terminator unit and damage boosts as the squad takes casualties. Again at 75 points, not awful, though you might be best off just going for a character that'll stack the damage boost as soon as the squad's active. Perhaps one reason to use him over other things could be getting the 6+ Feel No Pain enhancement in Dark Angels. Finally for tier 3, here's a trio of special characters. Unfortunately, Rabute Gilliman the Primarch I think is a bit overcosted at the moment. 360 points is quite a lot for his abilities, even if he does come with some very serious melee damage, plus some interesting things like Double Oath of Moment and free stratagems nearby, plus his Armour of Fate gets back up mechanic the first time that you slay him most likely. I've still seen occasional people use him. He's a pretty powerful centerpiece model, and the buffs that he can bring are pretty good, maybe particularly so in Ironstorm Spearhead, where you can get extra battle tactics on vehicles, but in general he seems to be a bit niche, and more Ultramarines lists run Calgar by a long way. Torgaradon's 90 points, and has some good personal anti-vehicle damage, plus ignores cover for the unit. Maybe can be okay along with Aggressors and Apothecary Biologists maybe. Shame that he lost his lethal hits buff though. And Ironfather Phyros is 95 points. He gives a unit of maybe heavy intercessors a 5+ Feel No Pain, and then can sit around healing vehicles and giving them +1 to hit with a Tech Marine. I genuinely feel like he's pretty usable for the cost, though does require quite a specific setup for him, needing to get value both out of the vehicle boost things, plus also the Feel No Pain and his own personal melee stats. Moving up to tier 2 now, here's where the going's really starting to get strong for the Space Marines. Here I've chosen to rank units that I think have a bit more competitive play to them, maybe a bit more likely to crop up in optimized lists, but maybe not the absolute cream of the Space Marine choices. Perhaps a few more things here that are in more of a supporting role, or maybe a good in one specific detachment. Just due to the amount of stuff here, I thought we'd go through infantry and squads first, and then vehicles and characters after, before going up to Tier 1. First up, I think Games Workshop's done a good job of making the 3 flavours of Intercessor all fairly playable. The standard variety is 80 points, and you get 5 Space Marines with some fairly good bolters with the assault and heavy keywords, a bit of melee threat with a power fist and a grenade launcher, and just high OC and the sticky objectives type rule. Perhaps the single biggest selling point for them, as it's just handy to mark a home objective with that, and then march off towards the midfield to skirmish with the enemy. I think they're usable enough, though probably diminishing returns after having 1 unit to trigger that rule. The standard Space Marines can do fine on the battle line though. Next up for the Assault Intercessor cousins with chainswords. They're slightly cheaper at 75 points per 5 models. Really quite nice to have very cheap Space Marine bodies that have got pretty dangerous chainswords. They're perhaps best suited for throwing themselves at the mid-board objectives where they get full wound rerolls, which has helped them be a lot more general purpose and punch up against tougher stuff, both with a Power Fist or Thunder Hammer and their regular chainswords. They're particularly good for Blood Angels and Sons of Sanguinius that could get a whole ton of Strength 6 AP1 chainsword attacks, potentially with their Red Rampage stratagem to buff that even further. They can be very nice with characters as well, who can also get the wound rerolls. They still do have that obvious weakness of being far better against lighter troops versus heavy stuff though. Next up, we've got the Heavy Intercessors, 100 points per 5 of them, or 200 per 10. These guys have got genuinely strong standout defense for Space Marines. 5 Gravis armored bodies for 100 points really is quite a lot, at toughness 6 and 3 wounds apiece. And they do have some fairly punchy bolt rifles with longer range, plus a heavy bolter in the unit, and the rank and file strike at strength 5 as well. Despite that, their damage output is still weak. Big boosted bolt rifles do sound fun, but it's still not really all that outstanding for 100 points. And they do have some issues which generally see them not played in competitive anywhere near as much. You're basically paying the same amount of points for something that you could get a fun special rule for defending objectives, say like Intercessor's sticky objectives or Infiltrators denying deep strike, or if they're trekking off to the mid-board to make the enemy actually have to deal with those defensive profiles. They're maybe not ideally suited to that, given that they're range specialists, not melee ones. Their best attachment likely being Anvil Siege Force for the potential +1 to wound maybe isn't the best for them either, given that that one's not considered to be particularly strong. Between all that, I'd probably rank either low tier 2 or high tier 3, certainly a unit that's a bit more strong in casual versus competitive. Next up, we've got the Leviathan box set Infernus Marines, 80 points per 5 or 160 for 10. Their Pyreblasters are particularly good at torching hordes. Mass Strength 5 auto hits is genuinely very good damage against light infantry if they can catch some within 12 inches. Their biggest main threat is being able to threaten some nasty overwatch in the mid-board, and they're quite nice to set themselves up somewhere where they're entirely within range of an objective, so that if the opponent moves onto it, you know you're going to be able to trigger overwatch with the whole squad. I feel like in normal circumstances they are kind of tame really, again not very general purpose, but they do get significantly better in Firestorm where they both get to advance and shoot and also get Strength 6 Flamers basically, and particularly if they've got Vulcan Hestan which could give you full wound rerolls, maybe paired with the Firestorm devastating wound stratagem. I feel like particularly there they kind of stand out, otherwise probably a bit mid. Not having objective control too like the Intercessors or any fun objective grabbing special rule beyond the good Overwatch are definitely disadvantages for them. Next up, we've got the Incursors, 80 points per 5 of them or 160 per 10. These guys are cheap scout moving infantry that have their big thing as marking one enemy unit for +1 to hits for the rest of your gun line. Having a unit of them can be really quite nice in a big ranged focus army, as that could potentially be a big accuracy boost on a whole ton of Space Marine guns, hopefully saving Oath of Moment for something else. Otherwise, I guess they're nice enough frontline skirmishers. They'll be able to deal with lighter infantry, and the Haywire Mine can hand out a bit of damage to anything trying to charge them. They won't be able to handle anything with high saves or good toughness though, and they are objective control 1. I'd consider them kind of diminishing returns really, as you're going to be marking successfully less important things to get that +1 to hit on, and Oath of Moment can carry you to a ton of hits anyway. Next up, we've got the Aggressors, which previously I would have considered a bit more of a standout unit, and they're still certainly not bad. I feel like at 120 points per 3 though, they do actually need to be used to the absolute maximum, and have some sort of scary detachment specific damage combo on the go to really make them worth it. They still absolutely have enough damage to justify that points cost. A whole ton of twin linked attacks and frag storm shots at range, then a bunch of power fist attacks with twin linked hitting on 3+ in melee. If you can get a full round of shooting and fighting out of them against important things, they really can tear a pretty huge chunk out of an enemy army. They're nice in Gladius where they can do fire discipline things, Firestorm with the twin linked flamers being quite nice with devastating wounds, and the Vanguard Spearhead where they can potentially infiltrate, maybe with Marnius Calgar attached as well, plus an Apothecary Biologist to bear the enhancement. If you're not doing shenanigans like that, they could use a Land Raider to get them into effective range, which is quite a nice way of getting them into the right place, then shooting and charging. They could be an okay option for Overwatch as well, after they've even done their first set of damage. The main disadvantage is that at 40 points per Gravis Armored Marine, they're really quite fragile for the cost, and they are going to be right in the place where they're going to take loads of return fire. They do really need to hit spectacularly hard the first time round, as they might not have enough chance to do so again. Next up, for 85 points, we've got the Eliminators. These guys I still wouldn't say are an outright bad unit, but do seem to be kind of eclipsed by Scouts and Infiltrators right now. They do still have some interest though. They can either have some elite hunting las fusils or some sniping precision shots. The Sergeant can take an Instigator bolt carbine, which allows you to do some move shoot move shenanigans, which can be quite nice for getting across the board really quickly or popping in and out of terrain. They can also do some rules abuse with the firing deck of an Impulsor as well, jumping in and out and getting extra shooting activations, though I think in reality the setup of that isn't really worth the payoff versus just taking some more traditional gun tanks. Probably the thing that holds them back most is how fragile they are. You only get 3 bodies with 2 wounds versus the 5 that Scouts get for significantly less points, whereas the Infiltrators you take them more for the deep strike denial, which these guys don't get. Still not awful, though I'd probably consider Scouts and Infiltrators the more optimal infiltrate style units for Space Marines right now. Next up, we've got the Terminator Squad and the Terminator Assault Squad. The regular Terminator's 175 points per 5, the Assault Squad 185. These guys can be a pretty massive unit for big synergies. Even a small squad can be a lot of points, and you can take more than that if you want to. Characters and stratagems and things tend to have good value here. Terminators have got nice chunky defense, inbuilt deep strike, which can make them a good choice for rapid ingress. And while their damage output is a bit on the low side, at least their fairly general purpose with those power fists should be at least somewhat of a threat to anything they charge. Various armies can make some pretty good use out of them. They're a focal unit for the first company task force. You could potentially infiltrate them in Vanguard if you wanted with a big scary unit. Black Templars might well get along with the Assault Terminator squad with the devastating wound Thunderhammers. If they ever charge a Psyker, you could flex into some serious devastating wounds on a 4+ there. And I feel like there's a bit more of a renewed focus on them, given that they dropped 10 points per unit in the last points updates, though I still don't think it's got to the point where they're going to be one of the focal central Space Marine units going forward, probably still lower tier 2 versus upper tier 3. They tend to get played a lot more casually versus in competitive games, due to being kind of big, chunky, and easy to use. Next up, we've got the Blade Guard veterans, 90 points per 3 or 180 per 6. They're fairly general purpose Primaris melee damage dealers with some strength 5 and damage 2 mastercrafted power swords. Being the most dangerous Tacticus keyword melee weapon in the Codex, they're often first choice for things like chaplains, Judasirs, and can get some good value out of lieutenants or maybe Marnius Calgar himself. I feel like they're tough enough to consider slogging up the board with 4+ invulnerable saves and 3 wounds, though are very easy to deliver from a Land Raider. It is kind of a shame that they don't fit neatly into an Impulsor with a character, as otherwise I feel like that will be quite popular. They do have downsides though. Their damage will certainly struggle against anything that's toughness 10 or higher. I'd say just for their overall damage and defense, they're interesting but not enormously stand out. I feel like they are quite fairly costed. For 95 points, we've got the Company Heroes, 4 guys to accompany your chaplain with an ancient heavy bolter and a champion. They're really quite tough for the 95 points, 4 wounds apiece with a big -1 to wound when they're leading a character. They're a unit I consider quite good when they've got a good chapter specific captain to lead, but otherwise for a generic captain they're probably just not going to be the choice you want really. Generic captains will be good for their free stratagems they get each turn, and the company heroes usually aren't the squad that you'd usually want to use stratagems like that on. They're just a bit general purpose with a little bit of shooting, a little bit of melee, but not really being standout in anything. Their durability is good for just the 4 of them, but when you take into account the cost of the captain, it becomes a lot more mediocre. There are a few captains that could use their services quite well though. Uriel Ventris and Vulcan Hestan are perhaps the best examples. Uriel can deep strike a unit even if he's not leading it, so he could join these guys and use that valuable deep strike rule elsewhere. And Vulcan Hestan gets a really nice objective securing rule, so a tanky retinue is really quite nice for him to move on to a midfield objective while marking targets for big rerolls with flamers and melters. Overall, I'd say they're usable, but maybe not auto-include great. I think there's definitely some arguments to just running the characters with their cheap squad of assault intercessors for 20 points less. They're also pretty good on the objective controlling front, and a bit more focused in terms of melee damage, plus might give the characters their rerolls as well. Next up, the Devastator Centurions are 185 points per 3 of them, or 370 per 6. They have big hitting anti-tank firepower with twin-linked las cannons and missiles on the chest-mounted guns. Their raw numbers do stack up pretty well against things like the Space Marine tanks being fairly equivalent there. Their main disadvantages being that they're just not particularly mobile and are sort of borderline tough as well. Certain things with high AP and middling strength like melter weapons will make short work of them. What they are good though is great in Vanguard Spearhead, particularly with Uriel Ventris paired with them. You can have them redeploying around the board for 1 CP to make sure they can always draw a bead on the thing that they most need to, which is really quite scary with some big firepower like this. Even if you're not playing Ultramarines, then they could just be turning up at the side of the board each turn and getting the best shots that they can. Out of that though, I feel like they're maybe not really going to be the optimal choice versus things like tanks. They have similar sort of scary damage and defense, but just not the mobility of the Space Marine armor, and have other weaknesses like not being able to fire if they get locked up in close combat, unlike vehicles. Finally, for the infantry and squads here, we've got the Outriders. They went down in points really quite a lot, all the way down to 80 points per 3 now, to the point where I think they're really quite usable. They are very fast being on bikes and can auto-advance 6 inches, and while their damage isn't particularly exciting, they are really tough for the points. 4 wounds at toughness 5 on the 3 models is pretty good, and they can be a nice objective skirmishing and trading unit, able to clear out a bunch of enemy infantry with those chainswords and bolters, and then not be the end of the world if you lose them in return. Their objective control is really not bad for the 80 points as well, getting 6 OC between them. Their main issue is they just struggle to kill anything that Strength 4 and AP-1 can't handle. So in some matchups they're just going to have to lean into their speed and things and focus on doing objectives as opposed to really being much of a damage unit. Next up, let's move on to the vehicles and characters that are listed in Tier 2. First up, we have the Impulsor for 80 points. It's got a transport capacity of 6 with a 12-inch move and a firing deck. I say its durability is good enough for 80 points, and then you've got the main option of what you take on the top hatch upgrade. I'd be most tempted either by the 5+ invulnerable save shield dome or the Bellicaster's missile array, just throwing out an extra fairly high power shot each turn. As mentioned, it's a shame that Blade Guard can't make particularly efficient use of these, but otherwise in the core codex, perhaps Hellblasters could be one of the better choices. The firing deck works quite well for them, and they could potentially soak hazardous rolls on the wounds of the transport itself, which is kind of nice, and there's room for them with a character if they want to do some disembarking and fire discipline type things. Sword Brethren could be another interesting enough option for the Black Templars, and the Black Templar version also gets a multi-melter as well, which makes the whole transport affair a bit more scary. Can be a nice enough option in their Ironstorm to hide some scary melee as a countercharge within. Next up, there's the Brutalis Dreadnoughts that I probably would have put down in Tier 3 before the points update. Dropping down from 175 to 160 makes this thing a lot more efficient. At that price tag, I'd rate it as at least fairly cheap and tough. Its durability maths out at least fairly similar to the Redemptor these days, depending on exactly what's targeting it. The trade out of being 50 points less sort of evens out with the -1 damage. And I think it's quite important that this thing's durable, given that it's a slow-moving melee walker that needs to move around terrain, and it's almost certainly going to take some fire before it gets into combat. If it does manage to reach melee, its presence is going to be felt. Its charge deals out a bunch of mortal wounds, and you can potentially double down on that to make it very scary with tank shock. Then backs that up with a whole bunch of twin-linked fist attacks, maybe with an anti-horde mode if you take the Talons. It's quite nice in Gladius, with access to advance and shoot and advance and charge. It does get some twin multi-melters, which aren't nothing as well. It perhaps feels like a vehicle to take 1 or maybe 2 of. Maybe having some slightly diminishing returns after you've got the first couple of movement lanes that it wants to move down filled up with 1 angry dreadnought. Next up for 140 points is the Ballistus Dreadnought. This one mounts 2 las cannons and a couple of missile shots that you can swap out for anti-horde missiles as needed. This thing is a pretty scary and durable gun turret from the Leviathan box set and gets some inbuilt rerolls against things that are relatively intact, which is usually going to trigger probably more often than not. Overall, I'd say its damage output is fine. It's probably more impressive for its durability stats than its damage compared with some of the other Space Marine vehicles. It could certainly enjoy Ironstorm with auras of lethal hits and some nice inbuilt rerolls to wounds that maybe feels like kind of the same level as plenty of its competitors as opposed to being enormously standout. Next up, the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike is 160 points. This one gets a +1 to wounds debuff against enemy monsters and vehicles, plus a bit of middling sort of anti-tank or anti-elite damage between some missiles and its last talon. Its raw damage and defense aren't really much to write home about, paying a premium for its speed and its debuff. I think it's usable if you've got a fairly gunline focused army and you want to have a bit more bite against the toughest stuff in the enemy army. That +1 to wound can be a really big deal if you're just trying to focus down one massive threat, and not take more than one, but one is usable enough, I think. Next up, we've got the Gladiator Reaper and the Gladiator Valiant, both are 150 points. The Reaper's the one with the onslaught cannons and the sustained hits that absolutely mows through enemy infantry. The Valiant is the shorter ranged one with the multi-melter sponsons that quite likes handling elites or maybe vehicles at closest range. The Gladiator Reaper is enormously standout in Ironstorm, where if you're playing that detachment, I'd rate it absolutely top tier. It works very well with the various buffs and stratagems that detachment can get, plus it's very nice to be able to chew through enemy screens and hordes, which could be an issue when you don't have that much objective control on the table in most of those. With the devastating wounds from the Gatling cannons and the twin linked, it's genuinely good against heavy infantry as well, and isn't irrelevant against vehicles. And I could have happily ranked it tier 1 as well. I'd say it's borderline upper tier 2, lower tier 1. Otherwise, the Gladiator Valiant I'd say is maybe a little bit more niche. The range on it I think is a significant disadvantage, particularly given that Gladiator tanks aren't enormously tough. Might mean that you need to expose it a bit too much and it gets destroyed in return, though it can work quite well with Firestorm. Being able to advance and shoot is quite nice for the range, plus getting strength 10 multi-melters in close is quite a big deal against some targets. I would say that both of these tend to be maybe a bit more detachment dependent versus the Gladiator Lancer though, which is pretty much good regardless of where you field it. Next up, we've got the Repulsor and the Repulsor Executioner. The Repulsor is 190 points and the Executioner 220. The big chunky floating hover fortresses are generally quite tough at 16 wounds and toughness 12. You are going to need some serious focal anti-tank to destroy them. Both of them pack some fairly serious firepower. Out of the two, the Repulsor isn't quite as scary as the Executioner, but mainly focuses on being an enormous hovering transport, a big transport capacity which is quite nice for ranged units to jump out of, and then if they get charged they can jump back inside its cavernous hold. Otherwise, the Executioner is just very scary as a great big gun turret and can use its transport capacity situationally if it makes sense to. The Laser Destroyer is really quite spooky, plus it gets some nice onslaught Gatling cannons and defensive arrays to back it up. The Executioner maybe does particularly nicely in Ironstorm, and the regular Repulsor maybe in Firestorm. The transport shenanigan options right there can lead to some pretty fun options. Next up, the Trusty Vindicator is 175 points and got a decent decrease in the latest points updates. I'd say it's genuinely quite a solid all-round danger tank now. A bunch of strength 14 attacks at 24-inch range with good AP and good damage, fairly tough at toughness 11 with a 2+ save and access to Armor of Contempt, and that rule that allows it to fire to good effect in melee, even hitting things in close combat with it without penalty. It's particularly terrifying in Ironstorm with access to some good rerolls and Mercy as weakness. I certainly consider it a top tier unit for Ironstorm Spearhead. Next up, out of the two Predators, I consider the Destructor perhaps the better one for 130 points. In general, people tend to take las cannons on the sponsons, and then the auto cannon is just quite a nice general purpose gun. It gets extra AP against enemy infantry and things, and that can be quite nice with a whole bunch of attacks at damage 3, quite good at hunting things like enemy custodies or terminators. As with the rest of the vehicles, it certainly enjoys Ironstorm and is stronger there than elsewhere. Finally, we've got the standard Land Raider at 240 points. This is the big tough melee delivery tank with las cannons on the sides. If you've got a scary Space Marine unit like say Sword Brethren or a big aggressor or blade guard combo, then this can get them into combat, plus keep them pretty safe when they're on their way there. It's very tough to take out with cover and armor of contempt, and can certainly chip in against enemy vehicles and heavies with 4 las cannon shots. Sometimes the smaller transport capacity can be relevant, as you need a redeemer if you want, say, a unit of 6 aggressors plus a character, but often it can do the job quite well. The regular Land Raider is taken a bit less commonly than the Redeemer though, and those very nice Flamestorm cannons, though sometimes still could be the right choice if you want a bit more anti-tank versus big Overwatch threat, and it does cost a bit less as well. I'd rate it borderline tier 1 versus tier 2, though I would say that the Redeemer is probably the stronger of the pair. Next up, we've got the Tyranid Hunting Combi Weapon Lieutenant from the Leviathan box set. He's 75 points for a relatively cheap and annoying to catch up with Lone Operative. He gets a nice reactive movement rule if the enemy goes in close, which means he could scamper back behind terrain or out of his Lone Operative range so they can't shoot him. Even if he can be directly attacked, he isn't guaranteed out for the counter as well. He does get a 5+ feel no pain and -1 to hit from stealth, and a special rule allows you to mark an objective with reroll 1s to wound against units that try and take it, which could contribute to the damage game a little bit, even if he personally isn't going to much. As it goes, I'd say is certainly a very usable lone operative. Can just be very nice for annoyance, a screening unit that you can't interact with, and maybe doing the odd secondary objective. He does get played at least fairly commonly in competitive lists. I'd probably say borderline tier 1, strong but maybe not auto-include. Next up, along with the Terminators, I've chosen to rank all 3 of their support characters here. I think they're at least fairly well balanced in points for what you get. The Terminator Captain's 95 points, the Librarian 75, and the Chaplain 75. In order, they basically give you free strats and reroll charges, sustained hits, and the Librarian's smite attack, and the Chaplain grants +1 to wound in melee plus mortal wound protection. For the cost, they genuinely are all handy enough. The Captain's one is perhaps a bit detachment specific, and for the Librarian or Chaplain, it depends on whether or not you want a general purpose damage boost or one that's melee specific. I'd probably rate the melee specific one as the better, given that they are stronger in melee already, but there's still some value to having a slightly unusually shooty Terminator squad. They are all a bit reliant on the Terminators actually being strong to be worth it themselves though, so will be very tied to their datasheet power. The Phobos Librarian is 70 points, and he can shield a squad from being shot at greater than 12-inch range with his shrouding. This one tends to be very nice for infiltrators specifically, given that they stop enemy units from deep striking within 12 inches, so it can make for a very safe home field objective. And then the Librarian can potentially help with the counter attack a little bit, throwing out some smites and things and adding a touch of melee. I have seen him used with some other fun enhancements as well, things like some movement shenanigans in some of the detachments, or potentially Master of Machine War in the Ironstorm. He does add a lot of points cost to an infiltrator squad though, if that's where you're using him. It'd be 170 points for that kind of utility, so it definitely has trade-offs versus more raw damage and defense for the front line. We mentioned the Terminator Chaplain, but here are the other Chaplain variants. They're kind of a bit squad dependent as to exactly what they're going to lead. They give you +1 to wound in melee, plus some other boost, usually a bit of leadership, maybe cancelling battle shock, or another damage boost. Adding +1 to wound is rarely a bad choice in close combat, and they do chip in with their own Crozius damage as well. I feel like they're nice enough for Blade Guard, Vanguard Veterans, or Jump Intercessors, or Blood Angels Death Company. I feel like the Bite Chaplain's probably the most niche out of them, just due to the Outriders maybe not being particularly good recipients of melee damage boosts, and the Ravenwing Black Knights maybe having better value from the command squads. I feel like as an actual datasheet he really isn't too bad, he's maybe just a bit lacking for units that are optimal for him. Next up, I thought I'd talk about the other captains as well. Again, maybe a bit of an odd one to rank, given that they're so detachment dependent. Their power entirely depends on whether or not the detachment's got good battle tactic stratagems or not. It can be quite nice with, say, aggressors in the Gladius task force with fire discipline, perhaps. Maybe fighty captains and Sons of Sanguinius with the lance stratagem, or maybe in Firestorm with aggressors and using the devastating wounds with Torrent Flamer aggressors. They're going to be far stronger in those detachments than elsewhere, where you might be using your free battle tactics on command point rerolls or armor of contempt. Otherwise, the regular captain on foot can be extra fighty for one turn once per game and does get a lot of play in Sons of Sanguinius. The Gravis captain is really quite tanky, though that's often a little bit on the irrelevant side, given that if his squad is dead and he's getting targeted, then it's probably a bad situation anyway. The jump captain can up the strength of a unit on the charge, which can be quite nice for things like jump intercessors slamming into the enemy. Overall, just a bit variable. I feel like they never stand out bad, given that Armour of Contempt and Command Point rerolls and good melee damage are all good things, but only in a few places are they really massively stand out, and some armies completely pass them up. Otherwise, for Tier 2, let's round up a few special characters. Year of Ventress is 75 points and is basically just a fighty captain without the free stratagems, though he gives one other unit deep strike. This can be something that is not leading, like Devastator Centurions, or something like Eradicators or Hellblasters being interesting choices perhaps. And he could have unusual units do rapid ingress things. I'd likely rate him Tier 2 in this one, or Tier 1 in Vanguard Spearhead, where having things like Deep Strike Centurions bouncing around the table can be seriously scary, as you can put them back into reserve for 1 CP. Otherwise, Darnath Lysander is 100 points and it gives you -1 to wound and a bunch of big hitting damage 3 in a Terminator squad. Hard to go wrong there, and he seems like a fairly fun include if you're playing Imperial Fists. Chief Librarian Tigurius is 75 points and is just a very strong all-rounder, -1 to hit for his unit, free Overwatch, and a bunch of genuinely serious damage with his psychic shooting attack. It's maybe just a bit miffed that he can't lead Hellblasters, as they feel like they'd be the good place for him. Even with Sternguard or regular intercessors though, he can be fairly fearsome. Corsaro Khan is very cheap for a Space Marine captain at just 70 points, pretty good melee and nice character killing, and gives a good buff to his lead units. He's alright with Blade Guard or Assault intercessors. And Pedro Cantor's 90 points, an alright generalist with a fairly scary power fist, some surprisingly good shooting, a damage buff when your unit gets damaged, and a big +1 to attack strike once per game that you could use at range or in melee. You could have some spectacularly high power shooting Sternguard for a turn. He maybe does feel just a little bit less obvious than a few of the others though, might be a little bit borderline between here versus tier 3. Finally though, let's get into the top tier for Space Marines, the units that are perhaps considered most stand out on raw datasheet strength alone. A bunch of stuff that just feels kind of hard to go wrong with in most attachments, and fairly regularly take up spots in competitive lists. Perhaps the single two standouts versus the other choices even here though are the Scout Squads and the Infiltrators. Just two good units that are going to help win missions regardless of what else you're playing with. Scouts are 65 points for 5 cheap bodies to put in the midfield, a pretty excellent Space Marine trading unit that have some actually okay damage with a missile launcher and a sniper rifle and a bunch of other attacks. They've got lots of options between infiltration and scout. You could potentially move them to actually deal damage to the enemy turn 1 if it made sense, or just hunker down on a home field objective, force the opponent to come out and destroy them with something, and then the rest of your army counter-attack in turn. As if that weren't enough, they also have that return to reserve option, which means they could be moving around the board in the late game if they survive. That can be quite a powerful option to have on the table for secondary objectives. Overall, hard to go too far wrong with a unit or two of them right now. Next up, we've got the Infiltrators, 100 points per 5 or 200 per 10. They can infiltrate, though are often tasked with guarding the home field objective, denying deep strikers out to 12 inches, including any crafty things that can drop 3 inches away. And this one's really quite a big deal, as it means that they can't be charged out of reserve and pretty much safeguard your home field objective, even if there weren't other things in support, provided you've at least got something to counter-attack. Otherwise, they're fairly tanky with a 6+ feel no pain for their Helix Gauntlet, and if your opponent doesn't have meaningful reserves, then you can just put them on a midfield objective and have them be just somewhat tanky objective traders. I say not sufficient for scouts as that same role, but it means that you can flex them depending on matchup. As mentioned, the Phobos Librarian is definitely a credible option and can make them even more annoying, and their main weaknesses are just having objective control 1 and really quite low damage, but that's not really the point of them too much. They're mainly just great for the deep strike and the infiltrate. Next up, Inceptors certainly aren't as godly as they used to be, though still having at least a single unit of 3 of them I think is far from the worst move in the world. Their thing is dropping in 3 inches away, and then attacking the enemy with a bunch of damage, either Twin Assault Bolters or the high power Plasma Exterminators. Both are good against the right targets. The Assault Bolters do Space Marines and below, the Plasma Exterminators are particularly good against 3 wound infantry. Having that 3-inch drop could guarantee that you can get certain secondaries, and occasionally if the opponent is a bit lazy about defending a primary objective and puts their squad half off it for some reason, they might even be able to swing a primary objective. For detachments, they're nice enough in Firestorm, where they get the +1 strength on their weapons and have access to a +1 to wound stratagem. Vanguard Spearhead can be quite nice for returning them to reserve if they do manage to survive, and Gladius is nice enough for a bit of fallback and shoot if they need it. Even if they can stand and fire in melee with their pistols, it still might not often be the best decision. Despite their advantages though, they're definitely priced at a massive premium for that now. 130 points is a lot for 3 Gravis armoured Space Marines, and they're very fragile. It means that people are far less likely to spam them, but I think that for the sheer utility, if you choose the exact right way to use them, they can be well worth it for maybe a unit or two in a list. Next up, for 95 points, are the Eradicators. These guys have truly pretty enormous anti-tank damage with their melter rifles, getting 4 rerolls to hit and wound against monsters and vehicles. Out of the entire Space Marine Codex, they have the best damage output per the low points cost against those targets, and that's even outside of melter range. If they get within melter range, then vehicles get utterly shredded. The main challenge is to coordinate them to their targets without them getting destroyed or tied up in combat and things, as they do have big weaknesses. They're slow moving, not really that tough for the cost, and ideally want to get in nice and close. And if you do have a detachment where you can't fall back and shoot, that could be a problem with them getting locked up as well. Firestorm is particularly nice for them, given that it gives you the +1 strength on those already scary melter, plus advance and shoot. Gladius can advance and shoot as well. They can work quite nicely out of a repulsor, or even out of strategic reserve, maybe even being a rapid ingress target in the right circumstances. Occasionally I've seen people do creative things with various character combos, though I feel like the easiest thing to do with them is just 3 model units and find some way to get range on them. Definitely a unit that needs some good support though. Next up, and certainly taking a big boost recently with a major points cut, are the Hellblasters. They were already at least a fairly threatening and easy to use unit with a bunch of spammed Strength 8, AP3 and Damage 2 shooting. Quite nice with a Primaris Lieutenant joining them. Getting a 24-inch range is easy to get them on their targets, and they get both the assault and the heavy keywords, which can either yield them more damage or extra movement to get range or line of sight. Shooting on death for them is really quite big, giving you get more damage output if you do fail any hazardous rolls, and sort of making that not feel like the worst thing in the world. But it can also be absolutely massive in the enemy turn as well, if the enemy tries to shoot these down with a bunch of guns. Getting a bit of reactive firepower could be big, particularly if they kill things that were yet to deal damage for the enemy. They could be a potentially really quite big investment unit for using characters or stratagems on them. You could definitely use Gladius Fire Discipline on them, or do some sort of combos with anvil heavy weapons, and they also work very nicely with transport, things like an impulsor with firing deck, or a repulsor if you want to transport a full squad of 10 and get them with their firepower to somewhere safe. At 23 points per model, their defense still isn't particularly great for the cost, though it's not as bad as some. And I guess their other main weakness is they might struggle a bit with toughness 9 or more, though lethal hits from a lieutenant or some other boosts that are similar can help with that. Overall, I feel like the points cut has genuinely tipped them from a place of being a sort of strong in casual but weak in competitive units to genuinely being fairly threatening in both. Can be nice with certain Space Marine characters, like maybe having Azrael of the Dark Angels to lead them. The invulnerable save and sustained hits works out quite well there. Next up, we've got the enormous armoured shell that is the Land Raider Redeemer. 260 points for a big scary melee delivery tank with the Flamestorm cannons. The assault ramp gets the close combat unit of your choice into melee at a average threat range of around about 20 inches, and then it can park in the midfield, hopefully within full range of an objective, and toast anything that moves onto it with the Flamestorms. Around about 13 average hits at strength 6, AP2 and damage 2 is an absolute death sentence for plenty of squads out there. I say the Land Raider Redeemer is strong enough to hold its own in basically any detachment, though it's quite nice in Ironstorm with vehicle bonuses or Firestorm, potentially with advance and shoot and transport shenanigans it can do. It'll also get on very well with Vulcan Hestarn of the Salamanders for rerolls both on the Flamers and its multi-melter. Overall a pretty strong unit and are probably rated as the strongest Land Raider variant right now. Next up, we've got the Assault Intercessors with jump packs, 80 points per 5 of them, a fast moving and pretty ferocious unit for this sort of points cost. Kind of crazy that they're the same points cost as regular Intercessors, as it means that their defense isn't awful and they just have lots of utility. They're very cheap for deep striking and doing secondary objectives, fast when they're on the board to skirmish with enemy units, and can bring enough damage to threaten heavier stuff that's above their points cost. Having a bunch of mortal wound impact hits really helps them out against tough things, plus a power fist on the sergeant and a couple of plasma pistols to take chunks out of heavies as they charge in. They can be very nice with Kayvan Striker the Raven Guard, or for Blood Angels with Sanguinary Priests, or maybe even Dante. You could certainly justify big units of 10 of them if you wanted to there. I feel like at 80 points they're in the place where they can both be used as a utility unit and a mainline threat if you want to, even if they are a bit more skewed towards lighter infantry with mass chainswords. Next up, we've got the Indomitable Redemptor Dreadnought at 210 points. This thing is a big, chunky, and fairly dangerous gun turret with some charge threat as well. It's usually carrying a macroplasma with a bunch of big damage 3 shots with high AP and blast, and it's fairly nice at clearing out heavier infantry, plus some Gatling cannon shots, storm bolters, and an Icarus pod to back that up. Its durability is pretty nice with a 2+ save and inbuilt -1 damage, and access to Armor of Contempt, and fairly easy to get cover. These things can definitely survive a fair bit of punishment. It'll like Ironstorm Spearhead like most big vehicles, though maybe feels a bit more well-rounded and an easy enough include just for a bit of more mainline strength and damage dealing in quite a few armies out there. I'd say it's maybe a little bit ahead of some of its vehicle peers still, though I'd still probably rate it towards the bottom of tier 1 here, either low tier 1 or high tier 2. I'd say it's probably kind of similar to the value of things like the Space Marine Vindicator and a few of the other threatening gun tanks, as opposed to being clearly massively ahead. Next up, I've also chosen to rank the Gladiator Lancer here at 160 points. It maths out to be one of the single best anti-tank damage dealers at long range for the Space Marines, a laser destroyer with a big strength 14, AP 4, and damage D6+3, and then inbuilt rerolls for hits and wounds to make sure those enormous strikes land home. It averages around about 10 wounds from a single round of firing against, say, a toughness 10 3+ save vehicle. And some things can make it scarier than that. Ironstorm can throw in an extra reroll, and it can hit on a 2+ if it's stationary. It's quite nice in that it can be a bit of a supplement to your main strategy, as it just doesn't really need any support beyond what it's got. Inbuilt rerolls means that it doesn't really care too much about Oath of Moment, so you can put that elsewhere. And it can just be pretty nice just to have maybe 1 or 2 of these floating around in the backfield, just so enemy armor knows that it absolutely can't relax, and a good round of shooting with one of these could take some massive damage off it. I guess the biggest weakness is that it's just not really all that general purpose. If it's just taking out elite infantry, it's probably not going to be as standout for the 160 points. Definitely good for the anti-tank niche though, in combination with other things. Finally, for some characters, the right ones are going to be dependent on the exact units that you use, and the biggest combos are going to vary detachment to detachment. I think for just adding threat to a unit, a lieutenant/apothecary biologist is rarely going to be the worst choice for the points. They give their unit lethal hits, so basically make them a lot more well-rounded against big tough stuff, and that's basically quite a good upgrade for anything that's, say, strength 8 or lower out of the Space Marine army. And that's quite a lot of their elites, whether it's Terminators, Aggressors, Hellblasters, Blade Guard, or any of the things with chainswords. They're particularly nice in Gladius, where you get to use that Fire Discipline combo, which could make Aggressors or Hellblasters ridiculously fierce, and they can both make some interesting combos happen, attaching alongside a Captain or Chapter Master, potentially meaning that you can have enhancements and a named character within the same unit. Can be nice with Marnius Calgar, for example, maybe infiltrating in Vanguard, or even just charging up with a whole unit of Blade Guard with some lethal hits for an enormous Death Star unit. Both have a few other advantages as well, such as the Lieutenants being able to fall back, shoot and charge, which is nice, and the Biologist's extra objective control if you kill things in melee. The standard Lieutenant gets some good melee as well. I feel like he's just a particularly standout, good value character to add into most squads. Otherwise, if you've got the vehicles to support, a Tech Marine at 55 points is usually going to be pretty good. It's really cheap and gets some nice advantages, a +1 to hit for one vehicle of your choice, and healing D3 wounds on that same vehicle. The pseudo lone operative rule is nice for standing on objectives kind of out in the open, and gives the opponent a unit that they can't really interact with, and then they do have a bit of threat on their own, both a little bit of range and some actually surprisingly okay melee, and that melee gets even better if you destroy one of the vehicles nearby him and he goes into Nerd Rage mode for breaking one of his toys. Tech Marines of course are absolutely godly in Ironstorm Spearhead with access to some great enhancements and an army of vehicles to back them up. It's pretty auto-include to take at least multiple ones there. Though provided you've got say a couple of scary tanks that they could credibly use their abilities on quite well, then I feel like you're not going to go too far wrong. Finally, we've got a few of the core Codex named characters. I think Ajax Agatone for 85 points is worthy of a place in tier 1. He just adds a whole ton of value to maybe Blade Guard veterans specifically. His really big hitting, strength 10 and damage 3 in melee, plus a nice AP1 torrent flamer, and getting reroll to wounds in melee takes a mid-strength unit like Blade Guard to the next level. Having OC for the enemy really isn't bad either, and I think is well worth the 85 points. Marnie's Calgar might be the single most standout named character out of the core codex for 185 points. He comes with 2 extra honor guards that can also attach to the unit, so you can make a really bulky Death Star unit. And those honor guards are pretty tough to take out as well, with 3 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save and a 2+ base save, meaning that they're quite good for tanking damage for, say, a unit of aggressors. Otherwise, he adds an extra command point per turn, which is always good value, allows advance and charge, and advance and shoot, and fallback shoot and charge. Means that unless you destroy his unit, he's always going to be in a good position to deal damage each turn. And you can also pair him with a lieutenant or an apothecary biologist, who, as mentioned, could bear enhancements like infiltrating him up the board in Vanguard Spearhead, giving you a truly terrifying first turn charge threat in that particular detachment. Finally, for the named characters, the other two that I might put a little bit more tentatively into Tier 1, I could have happily said Tier 2 as well, are Kayvan Shrike and Vulcan Hestan. Both are 100 points. The Shadow Lord of the Raven Guard gives his unit lone operative style shooting protection, so that can give you a big scary unit of jump packs that the enemy can't deal with at range, and can be quite nice jumping around the board, taking out targets of opportunity, as they're likely to get the first strike rather than the other way round. He certainly chips in pretty well with his own melee damage as well, a bunch of twin-linked lightning claw attacks with AP2 and damage 2. Finally, Vulcan Hestan is 100 points. He's also pricey, but I think is very good value for the extra things that he brings. He's got an okay stat line for a fighty captain at base, alright melee, a fairly nice flamer attack, and a 2+ save. Though his main boost is to mark one enemy unit for some nasty rerolls with torrent and melter weapons that can be seriously good for certain units, like say Land Raider Redeemers or Infernus Marines, maybe even Eradicators against things that aren't monsters or vehicles. It's pretty huge when paired with Firestorm as well. The devastating wound stratagem works really well with those full rerolls for torrent weapons. On top of that, he gets nice objective control and a feel no pain type save when he's standing on one marked objective. Could be pretty good along with something at least somewhat tanky, maybe the company heroes to move up to the mid board and then basically guarantee that objective's yours until the opponent can take him out. Overall, I feel like there's easily enough value to justify his 100 points. Maybe still a little bit borderline Tier 1 versus Tier 2 though. There's plenty of competition for strong characters. In any case, I think we'll leave that there for now. Let me know what you think of the strongest and weakest units in Space Marines in 10th edition 40k right now. Look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas down in the comments below. Look forward to hearing any thoughts and feedback as well. Are there any units that you'd rank a bit higher or lower? If you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to the channel. I do tend to post new 40k videos just about every day. I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Space Marines. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all of these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.